For me, this week began with some seriously bad RNG. So today we're going to talk about that. If you play video games, or to a lesser extent have a background in computer science, the acronym RNG is probably already familiar to you. For everyone else, RNG stands for Random Number Generator. And while we'll get into what that means, to contextualize it in what I said at the beginning of the video, bad RNG is shorthand, at least in the gaming space, for randomness within video games that is so unlikely that you would not have been expected to prepare for it. So, for instance, if you're imagining a dice game, the likelihood of rolling 6 ones in a row is very low, and so it would not make sense for you to plan for that to happen. But let's be honest, it generally gets used as a scapegoat when someone is frustrated that their strategy or their plans fell apart because there was bad luck involved. And so bad RNG is something that gamers scowl at and scapegoat as the root of the reason that they lost, not a lack of skill or anything else, just that the game was cruel and the results were staggeringly unlikely. As I mentioned earlier, this week a few dice rolls didn't go my way early in the week, and I found myself angrily muttering about the fact that my luck was bad, or there were a series of unlikely events that caused frustration. And in this case, most of them weren't video game related. But I realized that my experience in computer science and my experience in games has really informed the way that I think about randomness. And I think that randomness is a huge part of all of our lives, so I thought it would be an interesting topic to talk about. Randomness, at least true randomness, doesn't exist in the way that we think about it. The idea that something is completely and perfectly random is incredibly elusive. And at least from the short Googling that I did, the only place that it is believed to exist in the universe today is in the world of quantum mechanics, in something called quantum fluctuations or vacuum fluctuations. But that doesn't mean that we don't need randomness to make a great many things in the world occur. And specifically in the world of computer science, we have lots of ways to generate pseudo-random numbers. I say pseudo-random because the way that randomness works in the world of computers, which are highly deterministic, is you provide it a seed, and then from that seed, the computer is able to create a sequence of numbers that are apparently random, but as long as the seed is the same, the sequence of numbers will always be the same also. So the way that this usually works is you pick a seed that is very difficult to know, like let's say the number of seconds since January 1st, 1970, and you put that in as the seed, and then you get a series of numbers that would be very, very difficult for anyone to predict if they did not know the exact moment that you seeded the random function, and also what exactly the random function is doing. A more humorous example of trying to find things that are apparently random is the company Cloudflare that used a series of webcams observing lava lamps in order to generate their random seeds. The idea being that lava lamps blooping up and blooping down is unlikely to be easily predicted, and so as a result, the seeds that were generated were relatively random. Outside of the world of computer science, we often think of a coin flip as a random event. The probability of landing on heads or tails is 50-50, and so it's kind of impossible to predict which way the coin will land. The reality, though, is that that appearance of randomness is much less about the fact that some type of magic that is impossible to predict is happening, so much as the fact that the series of influences on that system, the air friction, the exact velocity that it comes off of your finger, the rotational speed, the way that it lands exactly, how that interacts with the hardness of the surface. All of these variables are critically important to perfectly understanding how that coin will land. And so as a result, we lack the ability to predict which way it will land, and so we deem it random. But in reality, it is only random in the sense that we cannot predict it. And I think that's a good way to think about the difference between randomness and true randomness. Randomness is just the difficulty to predict something. Something could be ostensibly impossible to predict because we don't know all the variables that go into it. Whereas the idea of true random is something that it is impossible to predict. And it raises an interesting question of whether or not true random actually exists. If for a moment, though, we assume that true random exists, there is a line that exists that demarks what is random and what is truly random. And this is really interesting because that line can be used rather than to represent randomness as representing what is knowable and what is not knowable. Essentially, if we think of random, or true random in this case, as something that it is impossible to know, then if we can define true randomness, we can also define the things that are impossible to know or unknowable. So to that point, earlier, I made a point about the fact that the thing that we think right now is truly random is what are called quantum fluctuations. And I am not going to pretend to understand what quantum fluctuations are, but they're also called vacuum fluctuations, and they seem to have to do with the amount of energy contained in a point inside of a vacuum. The point, though, is that right now, if we measure that, we get something that we believe is truly random. And there are entire startup companies that are devoted to using this method to create truly random seeds and truly random numbers, because true randomness is great for security through cryptography, and the list kind of goes on and on. But the question that I think is interesting is, are these quantum fluctuations truly random? Or is it just the limit of human knowledge at the moment that means that we lack the ability to model and understand all of the variables that lead to the apparent randomness that we're seeing? All of this is to say that if we don't know what we don't know, then how can we know if something is truly random or not? But enough about the theory of randomness. Let's back up to the original thesis of this video, which is that I had a series of unfortunate events at the beginning of this week that got me thinking about our relationship to randomness, or at least our relationship to things we perceive as unforeseeable, aka random. And in that space, the first place that my mind went was to games. Not specifically video games, but games in general. And one of the things that is at the core of understanding game theory is randomness versus the absence of randomness. There are certain games that do not have any randomness. Chess, checkers, Go, tic-tac-toe are all good examples of non-random games. Every game starts in the same state, and then humans interact with the different pieces, etc., and that is how the game plays out. However, there's a second genre of random games, and a lot of computer games fit into this category in one way or another. But you can also think about card games. If you shuffle a deck of cards, if you roll a couple of six-sided dice, any of these actions are introducing probabilities, and probabilities are at the core of a huge amount of the games that we play. And in those games, it is our job to create a strategy that mitigates the randomness inherent in the system. In my case, on Monday, the game that I was playing required me to prepare for a series of random events. and I got a particularly bad series of events that led to the demise of one of the characters that I had a vested interest in. And that is a pretty common trope across video games, in the same way that in a game of Texas Hold'em, you are dealt random cards and then need to have a strategy in order to mitigate that randomness in order to, on average, come out ahead. The example from gambling that I think is easiest to wrap your head around is blackjack. There is a right way to play blackjack that will yield the most consistent and best results for you. That way of playing is a strategy designed to minimize the negative effects of the randomness of shuffling on your ability to, on average, win more hands. And this is certainly not limited to games alone. We in our lives are constantly attempting to make affordances for what we perceive as the randomness in our lives. We budget extra leeway in our schedules so that we can definitely make it where we need to go on time. We buy insurance so that if we get sick, we'll be able to pay our bills, or if our house gets hit by a meteor, we will be able to repair it. All of these actions are about us recognizing that the world is not something predictable. It's not something that we can look at and say, we understand what will happen. And so as a result, we go to great lengths in order to create strategies to mitigate those random events and make sure that on average, we come out ahead of the game. And I think that's really interesting. The idea that our existence as people is so tied up in randomness. There is so many things that we are unable to predict, so many events that present as random, and so much of our existence is spent trying to mitigate the negative impacts of the randomness that we live with on a day-to-day basis. So I think my perspective is a little different. I think that my exposure to computer science, my exposure to gaming has influenced the way that I look at the random events that happen in my life and the strategies that I make to fix that randomness, to survive that randomness. At the end of the day, I often look at particular moments of misfortune or bad luck and just find myself wondering, if the seed had been slightly different, what might have happened? Would the outcome have been significantly different? Would I have not stubbed my toe? Would I have won the lottery? Because at the end of the day, all of life is about the fact that we don't know the seed. We don't know all of the parameters that inform the random number generator that determines what happens and does not happen to us. And I think that's really fascinating. And so I wanted to share it with you. So I hope that this has brought a different perspective to you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. Not a potamus. Ponderous.